This is Hannibal here from the Hannibal TV on YouTube. And today I have a returning guest for the third time. We have the British author, journalist, and TV personality from shows such as Ancient Aliens, as well as a couple Netflix shows I've noticed recently, as well as movies and other things. He's known for investigating UFOs, and he was at one time employed by the British Ministry of Defense working at the UFO desk. Nick Pope, how are you doing today, sir?
Good. It's good to be back on the show. Thank you for having me.
Well, it looks like since the last time I talked to you, we were right in the midst of all that drone news, and we finally got a statement from the president's office yesterday, which I'm sure you know all about. So I'm wondering if we could get your thoughts on that to start with.
Certainly, yes. And I have to say, it's a bit of a weird one. President Trump had been asked about this in the run up to the inauguration, and he'd said, I'm going to have a report on that on day one. And then he was in the Oval Office doing the signing of the executive orders. And I think Peter Ducey, the journalist, shouted out a question, said, hey, what about the drones? Trump looked over to his chief of staff and said, hey, Susie, can we get a report on that? What's the deal? And then sure enough, this statement dropped saying that it was FAA authorized drones undertaking research. But of course, that has kind of prompted more questions, in a sense, more questions than answers, because a lot of people are pretty riled up about this and are saying that's not what we saw. This was not drones. That's the whole point.
Do you consider that a better answer than the Biden administration was saying, where they were basically saying this was nothing but misidentified civilian drones and it was nothing nefarious, nothing to worry about?
Well, it takes us to a next level on this. But as I say, it still hasn't satisfied many people in and around New Jersey who've seen these things up close and personal and have said, look, we see drones and, this was something else. Some of these things were the size of a car or a truck and things. Now, I know it can be difficult to assess size, particularly at night and when you're looking at something in the sky. But I think people have asked for and deserve a little bit more information than we've had. I appreciate the administration has a lot on its plate at the moment, but I think, what FAA authorizations, what research, and even then, are we really sure that this explains all of the sightings, or might it be that it explains just some of the sightings? Because let's be clear on this. Some of the drones that have been seen over the UK and Germany, the assessment there is that those are adversary drones, probably from Russia. So if that's possible with these European sightings, how have we eliminated that for these United States sightings? So still some questions.
Do you think that kind of blanket statement that these things were FAA approved includes the ones that were flying over Air Force bases such as Picatinny Arsenal Base? And I know it wasn't in New Jersey, but wasn't Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, didn't they have closed down airspace for a day or two due to some of these drones flying around?
And Langley. Yeah, so this is where I think Congress needs to step up to the plate again. Congress, of course, is already in the middle of a process of holding a series of public hearings on this, but they're also getting classified briefings. And this is a good test for Congress in terms of this issue and the second Trump term. And it's incumbent on Congress to go maybe to the White House direct and say, look, we're assessing the whistleblower testimony. We've had classified briefings from Arrow and others. We are holding public hearings. We heard your statement about the drones, and we want a little bit more flesh on the bones with this, and we want wider answers on UAP, because of course Trump was interviewed on Joe Rogan's show and made, he was asked about the JFK files, the RFK files, the MLK files, gave assurances that previously withheld material would be released. And it's clear that in President Trump's mind, he links the UAP issue to things like JFK because of the public interest, because of the perception that there's been a cover-up. So Congress needs to kind of take the opportunity here. The door is kind of open, and they need to push it in and push back and say, let's have a hearing on this, and let's have some more accountability.
Yes, because speaking of Congress, Congresswoman Nancy Mace I think she's from South Carolina, she's been on the record twice, once with Fox News in December and once with a podcast in the US earlier this month, saying that there was two types of drones that they still haven't identified. And this was told to her apparently in classified briefings. However, she said she couldn't tell you the shapes, but she said she could say there was two types that were unknown. So we can only assume these ones aren't part of the FAA blanket statement. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's the point. We should get away from thinking that FAA drones, if that's what this turns out to be with New Jersey, is a sort of catch-all explanation for everything that's been going on. Clearly, it isn't. We don't want FAA drones turning into a sort of 21st century version of the old swamp gas explanation, which then got trotted out by the US Air Force so often with sightings back in the 60s when they were running Project Blue Book. And I get that obviously people like Nancy Mace and Tim Burchett, who've been very, very proactive on this. I get that party loyalty is a thing, and that in the early days of this second Trump administration, nobody wants to maybe rock the boat too hard and contradict the press secretary, White House press secretary, when she makes those statements, because, like I say, party loyalty is important, particularly in those early days. But that being said, let's not just sort of say, okay, thanks for that explanation, move along, there's nothing to see. There is something to see, and there are still some questions to be asked, and I hope that Nancy Mace, Tim Burchett, and many others, both in the House and, of course, in the Senate, are going to keep pushing on this and keep asking.
And Tim Burchett, I did do an interview with him shortly after I interviewed you last time, and he mentioned that the orbs that were being seen appeared to be of unknown origin. Now, there is some confusion because it seems like there was some legitimate military drones in the air that, if you compare them to some of the military drones that are declassified, they do look very similar. Then there was civilian drones, and then there's been other stuff. So would you agree that there was at least some actual FAA approved drones in the air at various points of this?
Yes, I clearly the press secretary wouldn't have made those remarks unless she was very, very high confidence that what she'd been told was correct. But again, I said from day one of this New Jersey drone flap that we are never going to find a single neat answer to this, just as we're never going to have a single explanation for UAP more generally. Clearly, lots of different things are going on. Even within the drone community, there's hobbyist drones. There are FAA drones, whatever this turns out to be, whatever this research is. There are military drones. There are law enforcement drones. There are commercial drones used by realtors, for example, and surveyors and engineers and things. So there's a whole bunch of things. But then there are other things too. And Representative Tim Burchett is right to say that when you look at something like those orbs, for example, there are clearly things going on in our skies which are still of unknown origin.
There's a few people asking on here about this Skywatcher thing that's come out where they claim they have been controlling some orbs over New Jersey, allegedly. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I've seen the allegations. I've seen the commentary on this. I mean, I think some of it becomes a little difficult to assess in terms of the accuracy of it. But I mean, clearly, this is an organization that does seem to have deployed to the area. I mean, initially to try to help with this, to try and help with the investigation, and to try and say for either local law enforcement or the people of New Jersey more generally and the elected officials, look, we're going to help deploy assets and try and figure this out. But I think that's kind of segued into something a little bit more. All I can say is at this early stage, I'm watching this still unfolding story with interest.
Yeah, as far as this whole thing that's come out recently with that Jacob Barber News Nation story where they have some of these military people alleging what Stephen Greer has been claiming for a long time, that you can kind of summon UFOs in a way. But the thing that where it kind of makes me question the credibility is, if this kind of phenomenon is possible, why is there so little evidence of it? I could understand that some of the military stuff might be classified, but if it seems to be this easy to summon UAPs, wouldn't there be more unquestionable evidence about it?
Absolutely. You'd think someone would summon a mothership and come down over central Manhattan or something, and then we can stop debating whether this is all true or not. I mean, I'm sure there are people that say, oh no, it doesn't work that way. Well, show us how it does work. And if you're going to make those sorts of claims, where's the beef? Kind of, show us what you've got, show us what you can do. I think one of the problems here is that when you get these sorts of claims, they're very difficult to assess. And then you've got a very confused situation because you've got whistleblowers who claim that they were part of covert government and intelligence community programs on UAP, and that the government has itself used people with these sorts of abilities as part of the program. And so some of these people are going direct to Congress. Some people perhaps still are going directly to AARO, who are congressionally mandated to receive whistleblower testimony, and some are going to the media. And so you get people looking at these sorts of claims, seeing the videos that we've seen, like the so-called egg-shaped video that we've seen recently, and people are kind of just asking themselves, well, what's going on? Who is assessing this? Is this being media led? Which parts of this are being looked at by Congress? Because the thing about Congress is that you don't get into that room to testify until you've been vetted. So that's a useful thing in and of itself. But when you see someone on the media, it's less clear who they are and what their backstory is.
I know you work with News Nation regularly, and I like their programming overall. But do you think that they went about the Jacob Barber story the right way? Because a lot of it is believable, but they seem to also go down a route that's going to take most people out of believing the story, even if the guy is credible as far as the summoning of the UFOs. And then the second interview they put out is extremely long, and there's a lot more kind of out there stuff talked about in it. Whereas if they had stuck to more of the believable things that had more evidence to it, it might have been a little easier for people to digest. Like, I think David Grush may have been accepted a little bit more when his testimony came out.
It's a tricky one. I know a lot of those folks at News Nation very well, and they're people of immense ability and integrity. On balance, I think they actually did do the right thing, which isn't necessarily to say that it's gone the way they would hope. I think if you get a story like this, and you obviously want to be the first one to break that story, and then you hope that the rest of the media are going to kind of follow along, and you'll have that great kudos. And I know they feel that there was some degree of dirty tricks here, maybe to sabotage the story. I think the problem, in a sense, is the story itself. That, as you said, it is in places something that stretches credulity somewhat. Having said that, this is why I say I think they did the right thing. You can't edit your story to just because you're a little worried that some people will have some issues with it. If you vet the person, and I know that they vet these people, they wouldn't let them on TV without that, because if it all blows up in their faces, their credibility is shot. So they absolutely vet these people. But then what they can't do is say, let's run this part of the story, but let's just leave that part completely out because I think it pushes the boundaries too much. No, that would be dishonest. And so they're in a kind of difficult situation because they know, as journalists and broadcasters, that some of this is very hard to get your head around. But like I say, you can't selectively insert yourself into the story and say, I'm going to run these parts of it, but I'm going to drop those parts, because then you're not telling the story. Put it all out there and let the people decide. So it's a very tricky one, but I think they did do the right thing. And doing the right thing isn't always easy.
Now, you talked about this in a way the last time, but there's a fan on here. Since we talked last time, Jeremy Corbell has done a Tubi documentary with TMZ where he's alleged that there's going to be some type of fake alien invasion in 2027, where the government is going to allege that there's some giant ship coming this way and is going to arrive here in 2027. You said a month or so ago that you'd heard rumblings that something might happen in 2027. Is this the same thing you're talking about, or is this something totally different?
Well, I think it's related. I've heard for some time, I've probably heard for the last 2 years, on and off, people talking about 2027. One or two people have said 2026, actually, but 2026, 27. I've heard these rumors for a couple of years that there is going to be something big, and people have assumed that that is disclosure, that this is controlled disclosure. Everything we see is part of a drip feeding process to acclimatize people ahead of the actual event in 2027. Now, the idea that the event is going to be the arrival of a ship, and the related concept that that's actually a false flag, alien invasion or alien arrival, is not something I'd heard until I heard Jeremy say this is going to be the fake story. Well, that leads to the question, if that's the fake story, what's the real story? And why would the government fake that? I mean, is it, as some believe, sort of part of Project Bluebeam, a false flag alien invasion ahead of introducing a sort of Space Patriot Act, martial law, everything that comes with that, suspension of various civil rights and things? I think that's a bit of a stretch, to be honest.
There's a fan on here that wants to know your feelings of the whistleblower alleging that the U.S. operates in all countries around the world in the UFO field. We've heard this from numerous people now.
We have, and we've heard that story. I think it was the Daily Mail story a year or so ago about the CIA's Office of Global Access being the body that has kind of lead responsibility for crash retrieval recovery operations. And I mean, clearly, geopolitically, absolutely, we know the US is the big dog in the room. And we know, of course, President Trump has made some pretty provocative statements about Canada, about Greenland, about Panama. So it shows that there is certainly, from the top down, this desire on occasions to go in to other countries whether we're talking about through diplomacy and voting or other means, and whether that extends to UAP recoveries and other UAP related activities, I don't know, but we've heard that. I think I saw someone flash up their Immaculate Constellation, and sure, that whole business is still to play. People are still trying to assess that document, and I know that there's obviously Jeremy got pretty riled up about this because somebody gave that document to Jeremy. Jeremy gave it to Michael Schallenberger. Michael Schallenberger then testified about it, and Nancy Mace then read it into the record, and there are still some questions about whether Jeremy got the appropriate credit for that. I mean, clearly he didn't, but what the reasons for that were, I don't know. But again, so there's so many facets to this.
Yeah, then later in the day, I know they've played this down, but it seemed like Lou Elizondo kind of pushed Jeremy Corbett out of the way in the hallway there at the congressional hearing after. I don't know if that was an accident or what, but there was some weird stuff going on that day.
I think emotions were running high, but I mean, clearly Jeremy and Lou are both strong personalities. They can handle all of this, and if there were some tensions on the day, I think later on at that social gathering, the one where Jeremy said to the producer, "I'm going. Do you not think it's a good idea?" I think there was a sort of hearty, manly embrace, and I'm sure everything is good again, and they're friends. I mean, these things happen. It's a complex situation, a lot of big personalities here, and sure, there is a struggle for narrative control. I mean, I think that's human nature. It's not confined to UAP. So these things will happen, but they're both big enough to deal with that.
We've heard a lot of people like Tim Burchett say that Trump could very well be the disclosure president, and it could happen as early as March. Some government people have actually gone on the record saying that. Do you feel, after seeing this statement on drones that was more of a statement than a report, confident that a disclosure could still happen? And if it's not going to be a disclosure where they actually put a series of files out there, do you think it's going to be more of a statement like non-human intelligence, human intelligence is visiting us? Yes. More to come.
Yeah, if any president ever was going to disclose this, all presupposing that they have something tangible that they can disclose. If anyone can, Trump can, and would. You just instinctively know it when you see his bullish approach to so many issues, that if some bureaucrat, if some deep state operative were to brief him on the presence of an NHI, and then say, and for all sorts of reasons, Mr. President, we strongly recommend that we continue to keep this secret, as we've done for nearly 80 years. Trump would be the one to say, hell no, I'm just going to tell people. Yesterday's statement, I mean, the statement about drones I will be honest, it has kind of dampened those expectations in the UFO community somewhat. People were all fired up and thinking, oh yeah, Trump's going to disclose day one, the drones, and then probably, a month or two time, the whole thing, UAP, NHI, etc. This drone statement has made people say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like the great revelations we were promised, but maybe if it's the answer, it's the answer, and we'll just have to see what happens next.
There's someone bringing this up, and you kind of allude in your Abduction book about crypto-terrestrials. What do you think about the people that say that there could be aliens underground, whether it's military bases or there's actually like crypto-terrestrials that live underground, possibly on Earth? hidden away from us?
Well, sure. Throughout human history, we've had these stories of people interacting with the little people, with giants, with, I guess, monsters and cryptoids and things. And who's to say? You can point to moments in our history where scientists discovered creatures that were thought to have been extinct for millions and millions of years. And again, if we're talking about something that isn't necessarily right under our noses in terms of the environments we inhabit in our daily lives, then who knows what's down there? I certainly don't rule it out. And in some ways, for the people that say, for the skeptics who say in relation to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, well, you can't get here from there. If they're already here, that removes one of those big skeptical barriers.
For sure. And some people say that could also go into the underwater bases, which you've talked about, because we see these things going underwater and there could be connections underground from there. Do you think that could be two separate species or possibly the same species?
We simply don't know, and it's really, I mean, it's either is possible. I mean, a civilization could inhabit different environments within a planet. Some under the ground, some under the oceans. But there's nothing to say that if we share this universe, as I believe we do, with countless other civilizations, perhaps billions of civilizations out there, that why would it be the case that only one visited us? I mean, if interstellar travel is possible and we're dealing with extraterrestrials, all sorts of entities might come here from all sorts of different planets, and that of course might well explain the differences that abductees and experiencers report in relation to the entities they see, and the differences they report in what their experiences are like. Some people talk about horrific abduction experiences. Some talk about it in a sort of enlightened new age, the space people are here to help us way. They can't all be right. So maybe we are dealing with a lot of different people experiencing different things from different species.
The one story that you talk about in your abduction book is, I believe it was a woman that was being abducted and she was in extreme pain, and it was almost like they didn't understand that she could be in pain. So then they did something to stop the pain. But a lot of people that try and pass the peace and love narrative, which the pain might not be intentional, but as you mentioned, these abductions can be extremely painful and extremely traumatic. Could you talk a little bit about some of those cases that have been very traumatic to some of the alleged abductees?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think the thing to say right at the outset here is that these are non-consensual experiences. And I know some people have said, well, the government consented to this. Well, that's not really consent if it's do it to somebody else, is it? So these are non-consensual experiences for the most part, even if some people have a positive experience. So that should be the start point in any discussion. And yeah, a lot of people are very scared by this. A lot of people are in physical pain. A lot of people are deeply traumatized from a psychological point of view. I mean, even something like, and I've heard this in a number of cases, abductees taken onto a ship and kind of passing through solid objects, which at the very least set your teeth on edge, and if not, scare people senseless, and very unpleasant experiences. Now, I agree. I don't think this is deliberate, and I think it's kind of like there's a read across here to the whole UAP radiation issue, and a lot of people have said that they've gotten sick after close encounters. There are some cases that ATIP were aware of and ORSAP and looked at. There are some of the ATIP papers, some of the ORSAP, the 37 Defense Intelligence Research documents kind of hint at UAP radiation, physiological effects. No one wants to kind of say it out loud because it's still a bridge too far for some people. It's okay to talk about UAP and national security issues, but don't talk about the entities, don't talk about the abductions. So it's kind of dressed up a little. But like UAP radiation, I think any harms in these experiences are byproducts. It's like they're not aware. And that's interesting. And it does suggest maybe we are dealing, as many believe, with machine intelligence, artificial intelligence that doesn't even really truly understand in a visceral, sentient sense the idea of pain.
And you mentioned the idea of one of these abductees being walked through the door that you do discuss in your book, and we've heard it, and we've also heard it from some of these Brazil cases, these ships being able to pass through solid objects, and probably other cases too. At what point did you start to kind of accept that this could be possible? Because this is another one of the things that most people will be like, well, that's impossible. I'm just going to stop listening to this right now. Was there something that made you believe that this could actually be a thing where you can go through a solid object?
Well, I think somebody, and I can't remember who it was, said to me something like, well, try and, take your hand and try and pass it through the surface of your desk. And of course you can't. You move your hand and then you hit the surface and then you stop. But then, the next thing is, okay, now take a sink of water and do the same thing. And your hand does pass through that. And then you say, now do it with air. And of course it does it with that. Well, it's all matter. And even if you look at the matter of your desk, actually, if you start to look at it in a subatomic way, it's all neutrons and protons and electrons and when you look at that, it's mostly empty space. And so is it possible that you could take these structures that are frankly mostly empty space and kind of jiggle them around just enough that you could pass through a solid object? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a kind of fun way to approach the question.
And another thing I've heard these abductees talk about is when they're allegedly beamed up, it actually has an effect on the heart where it feels almost like their heart is going to explode. Have you ever heard anything like that, or is it pretty neutral for most people?
Well, I would say imagine if it happened to you. I mean, your first thought would be a kind of basic instinct thought would be, once you get over the what the heck's happening. But if that's happening to you, one of your concerns would be, am I going to fall? If you're going up a beam of light with no apparent means of support and you're a couple of 100 feet above the ground, my first thought, or one of my first thoughts, would be, shoot, what happens if they drop me? When you talk about elevated heart rate, I mean, it might be something to do with the experience, but it just might be good old-fashioned fear.
Very interesting. Now, you do talk in your Abductions book about the various possibilities of why they could be abducting us, whether it's for research or some sort of hybrid program or some sort of studying our reproductive systems. That book, I believe, came out around maybe 1998. Have you had any more revelations since then?
Since I wrote that book, The Uninvited, I have taken a step back from looking at abductions. Of course, some cases still come my way, and I discuss things with people who have had these experiences, whatever they may be. And I have many discussions with people who research and investigate this. I mean, literally, just by a bizarre coincidence, literally yesterday, I ran into Whitley Strieber, who of course is an interesting character in this field. And so it's always on my radar. That being said, I have focused more on the political, military intelligence community aspects of UAP and the mainstreaming of that subject, but I still keep up with what's going on. And I still, again, I go back to the point that if we are being interacted with by multiple civilizations, as many believe, they might have multiple agendas. Some of them might be studying us from a scientific point of view, like we would shoot an animal with a tranquilizer gun, put a tracker on it, and release it back into the wild and study its behavior. Some of what's going on might be, farming. We are being farmed or harvested for something, perhaps, whether it's DNA or whether it's blood or whether it's sperm and ova as part of a hybridization program. I've heard all of this. And then if you're more spiritual and metaphysical, you get into all this containers of souls talk. And I've heard those stories too. I sometimes think that the actual explanation or explanations might be something so bizarre we don't even have a conceptual understanding of it, let alone a word or phrase for it. Just like the old analogy of how would you explain quantum physics to a chimpanzee? Maybe we're at that stage and you couldn't really explain what these experiences are and what the agenda is.
You do mention the case of David Jacobs in your uninvited book, not in that big a detail, but I've heard several of his interviews back when he was doing interviews, and he seemed to think that they were slowly populating Earth potentially with some of these experiments they were doing as far as possibly creating hybrids. What do you think about that? And what do you think about his credibility in general as someone who says he's been abducted multiple times, where they were doing tests on him a lot of these times that included either punishments or rewards?
Well, I guess humans certainly do understand punishments and rewards, carrot and stick. And David Jacobs is a professor and retired now, I think, but I think he's professor emeritus. And as far as I'm aware, approached his work from a suitable kind of background, given that he had the status of a professor. Now, he does take a much more dark side view of this. One of his books is called The Threat, and he is very clear. He thinks that this is hostile. He thinks that it is an invasion. And I guess, like those old sci-fi series like The Invaders, what better way to invade than to slowly infiltrate? And then you don't need a stand-up fight or anything. You're already there, perhaps in positions of power and authority all over the world. So that goes into the mix too. I hope he's wrong, of course. I hope it's something positive and interesting and fun, but he might be right.
One thing I've heard about his story, a couple things that I found interesting, was he said that they were fascinated that we wear hats. And that was one of the things that they asked him a lot about. And they seem to have a real fascination with war and would show him images of war and get him to react to it and explain certain things about wars. And that kind of explains why we might see them a lot in war scenarios over the years. But is this something common with abductees that you've heard, or is this more David Jacobs?
No, there's actually, the question reminded me of another case that I looked into and wrote up in The Uninvited. And it's the kind of bizarre and surreal aspects of this. I mean, wait, hats. Why of all things would they be interested in hats? Well, let's flip it around and say that obviously if we're being interacted with by an extraterrestrial civilization, their technology, because they've gotten here and we can't get there, is way ahead of ours. So they're not probably going to be interested in our, I don't know, our computers or our aircraft, because, you know, to them, it's just something that they probably went through, you know, ages ago. But the more bizarre and abstract things, architecture, art, literature, clothing, things that are unique to any civilization, might be of more interest. And yeah, hats, why not? One of the cases that I wrote in The Uninvited, a group of very strange individuals who this abductee believed were extraterrestrials in human form, walked into an art shop in central London, spent a lot of time talking amongst themselves, and then purchased a single pencil. And just the surreal nature of the whole experience. And then she gave them their change, and they all looked bewildered, like they didn't understand the concept. They understood the concept of money, but it's like they didn't understand the concept of change. Now, I have heard stories like that, just bizarre, abstract things, time and time again. And again, that's why this doesn't get mentioned in Congress, because Marco Rubio is going to talk about national security cases, but he's not going to talk about this sort of thing. But I've heard those stories, absolutely, time and time again.
And you mentioned Whitley Strieber. I've read several of his books, probably actually more than several, and some of his stories are pretty out there, like with the cigarette smoking midget that was living in his house barely at one point and also running around the forest. But then he says a lot of credible stuff. What do you just take all of it and decide for yourself what you're going to take as more fact, or do you think that it's just his interpretation of various things that have happened to him?
Well, there's two things. Firstly, yeah, as you say, it could be his interpretation, and his interpretation may be wrong. If extraterrestrials or a non-human intelligence is interacting with us, can it do a sleight of hand and make us perceive things in all sorts of different ways, which may or may not actually reflect the reality of what's happening? Absolutely. I'm sure they would have that power and ability. But I think the other answer to the question is the same as when you asked me about News Nation. It would have been very easy for Whitley to say, I'm going to write about the things that sound rational, but cigar smoking midgets, I'm just going to leave that out because people will think I'm crazy. But if you're being intellectually honest, you can't self-censor. You can't say, that's going to make me sound like a nut, so I'm going to keep quiet about it. Because what if that's the most important part of the phenomenon? What if some of this is some sort of psychological test, and yet people are editing out the bits that are actually important for some bizarre NHI reason that we could not currently comprehend? So that's why, put it all out. News Nation, Whitley Strieber, whoever it is, put it all out, and then let people assess that themselves.
One thing I've heard him talk about recently, and he does research UFO events and everything, just like you do as well. He brought this up, these horns that seem to go off all over the world. And he said he associated these with some of the abductions that he had. He heard these horn like sounds, and he's like, if you've never heard these, search it up, horns around the world. And there's this unusual horn sound that you hear all around the world. I mean, that would be fairly easy to fake. But do you know anything about these mystery horns, you could call them?
I haven't really investigated it in any detail, but of course you'll hear some people talk about the trumpet of God, and you'll hear some people talk about these horns or trumpets or sounds in terms of something that they interpret in a religious way. And sometimes, of course, some people will interpret that from a sort of end times narrative perspective, that these horns sound towards the end of days. and people I know have tied this in with the idea of the rapture and the idea of some of the themes that we see in the book of Revelations. And of course, that brings us full circle, because there are many people, certainly in the US government, but I've seen it in the UK too, who interpret UAP in terms of demonic activity. So, whether we're dealing with extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials, crypto-terrestrials, gods, devils, angels, or demons, I guess, again, this is all just our interpretation of what people are seeing, hearing with these horns, and experiencing with the abductees.
The Dave Kruger is tipping $5, and he wants to know your thoughts on ETs in Antarctica.
I'm not an expert on that. I know that Linda Moulton Howe has done a lot of work on that, and she's had a lot of whistleblowers come to her. So I haven't really encroached onto her kind of area of expertise here, simply because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and that's a long-winded version of really saying I don't know. There are some interesting stories out there. I mean, again, you have the whole, wasn't it, Buzz Aldrin went down there, and a lot of world leaders went down there, and there was some kind of cryptic statements made. Every now and then you'll see something on Google Earth with people saying, hey, what's this? Or why is this being hidden? But I think eventually, here's an interesting thing. Whatever you think about the causes of climate change, clearly the ice is melting. If there's something under there, we'll find out sooner rather than later. And with more and more private satellites up, even though most of them don't actually go over the polar regions, but it's possible to do, maybe we will find out more about that in the next few years. Let's get some Starlink or equivalent down there and have a look, so that this isn't in the hands of the government anymore. But the whole Treaty of Antarctica issue is very interesting geopolitically, and I think when that comes to be renegotiated, we might learn a few things, perhaps.
Someone on here is asking about, of course, Hayam Meshed and Paul Hellyer both talked about an alleged galactic federation, but more specifically, I'd be interested in knowing your opinion on Hayam Meshed's revelations in his book, because now it's been out a few years. Have you ever seen an English translation of it, or done any more research into some of the allegations he made in his book that came out, I guess, 3-ish years ago now?
Yeah, no, I have not, and that's a shame, because it's clearly very important, and I wish the mainstream media would maybe engage on that story a little bit more, because I mean, he obviously is who he says he is, and in scientific circles is absolutely revered, and he was very much the father of the Israeli space program. Hugely talented individual, well connected with political leaders all around the world, and frankly, the sort of person that if there is this big secret, is the sort of person that would be in on it. And as you know, he said, yeah, there is a galactic federation. And that kind of makes sense, because again, we can only be anthropocentric in our view of this, but it's almost a given that if there are multiple civilizations in the universe, there would need to be some sort of forum for them to come together and discuss areas of mutual interest, to try to prevent conflicts, that sort of thing. And whether you call it the Galactic Federation or whatever you call it, there would be, it stands to reason, something like that. Because these sorts of bodies are almost like inevitable when civilizations form. I mean, a federation of planets, to borrow a phrase, is really only an extension of the idea of government, and any civilization that kind of would ever do things like big collaborative ventures would need a form of government. Otherwise, nothing would ever happen.
And you've been researching this for numerous decades now. How has your opinion changed over the years with all of this new evidence coming out? Has there been any big things that have really changed how you've looked at things, or did you learn enough from your time at the UFO desk that you had a pretty good idea of what's going on then, and not much more has come out to the public since then?
Oh no, quite the opposite. I'm always learning new things about this, and obviously I am still, I have contacts back at the Ministry of Defense, still friends and contacts. But more importantly, I've lived in the US since 2012, and I've developed a network of friends and contacts here, and so many of the people that we've talked about, whether it's Lou Elizondo or Jeremy Corbell or whoever it is, are people that I've met and with whom I discuss this. So, I'm not claiming to have deep insider knowledge of this, but I think I do have an insider perspective on this, and I am always learning. And I think a couple of things stand out to me. One, I have taken, and I've gotten some flack for this, but I make no apologies for it. I have taken a little bit more of a cautious view about people's ability to handle this, and COVID was part of that. That made me question whether we did have the societal robusticity and resilience that all the people who say we're ready for disclosure say we do. I'm not so sure. COVID suggested quite the opposite. And I've also related to that is the idea that there might be a dark side to this. Because look, if this really has been kept secret for 80 years, disclosure isn't easy. And there must be a reason for that. Why is it so difficult? And one potential answer is that there is a dark side to it in terms of what the NHI agenda is.
When you were working at the UK's Ministry of Defense UFO desk, you reviewed many unexplained cases. Looking back, were there any incidents that truly challenged conventional explanations? And do you think governments worldwide are taking this phenomenon seriously enough now?
Rendlesham Forest is the one that always comes to mind. This was December 1980, so it was before my time at the ministry, but I did a cold case review on it, and it's still over 40 years on, it's still completely unexplained. There are multiple aspects to it, and one I will make a prediction on Rendlesham, and the prediction is that so far Rendlesham Forest has kind of languished in a sort of second place to Roswell. It's the bridesmaid, not the bride, so to speak. But I know full well that many of the people on and associated with the UAP Task Force, ORSAP, ATIP, Arrow, they're all aware of Rendlesham. I'll make a prediction that we might get some information on some of these flagship British cases, like Rendlesham Forest, the Cosford incident, the Calvine UFO with the photos. We might get some information on that from US whistleblowers. So there's a prediction for you today.
That's pretty exciting. In recent years, the US government has changed a lot of their declassified reports names to unidentified aerial phenomena rather than UFOs. Do you believe this shift in terminology has to do with the way these cases are being looked at now as compared to the past? Or do you think it's just simply another name for UFOs?
It started as a rebranding, and I actually had a key role in this because it was myself and a colleague at the Ministry of Defense in about 1993. We decided to resurrect an old US term from the 40s, UAP, as part of a rebranding of this to get the subject taken seriously, not by the public. That wasn't our agenda. I mean, taken seriously internally. And I'm pretty, through a number of means, I got that information into the US political system. And And then, of course, when the US government started talking about this after the New York Times broke the story of ATIP and the US Navy videos, they said, yeah, we borrowed the term from the Brits. And so that acknowledged that work that my colleague and I had done in rebranding it. So part of it was a rebranding exercise, but partly it's factual accuracy. We wanted to get rid of the F for flying because some of these things were on the ground and some of these things were, of course, under the ocean. So that's why UAP, at first unidentified aerial phenomenon, but now rebranded again to unidentified anomalous phenomena, so that it makes very clear that we're not just talking about things in the skies.
Skeptics often argue that UFO sightings could be misidentified military tests, natural phenomena, or have psychological fast factors. Based on your experience, what percentage of cases remain genuinely unexplained after rigorous investigations?
Around 5%. I would say, and I've used these three figures quite a lot, 80% explainable with high confidence level as misidentifications, hoaxes, psychological delusions, whatever. 15% of cases, insufficient data to make a firm assessment. And that might be because someone reports an event years afterwards and it's really just a story. You can't do anything with it. And 5%, I would say, unexplained. Those figures, might change somewhat, but I would look at the 5%, and I'm not really interested in the rest of it. Skeptics are right. Some UAP sightings are attributable to hoaxes. Some of it is secret prototype aerospace technology. Yeah, sure. Everyone knows that. Not interested in that. I want to eliminate those as quickly as possible and study the core phenomenon.
Now, I know you never had any UAP experiences, at least from the last time I asked you, or from what I've seen online. I haven't either, but I did notice I got your abduction book by audio. And when I would listen to that falling asleep, I would have horrible nightmares. Do you think that's just because you're listening to this kind of creepy tape? And when you were doing this research, did you ever have any experiences like that, like UFO related nightmares when you're really delving into this information?
I didn't, frankly. I mean, I should shout out to, I think it's Gordon Mack who did the narration for the audio book. They made a perfect choice. He's got a great voice, and yeah, I mean, if it, I'm not setting out to scare people, but some of this information is a bit dark side and things. So if it has that visceral reaction, in a sense, that's good, that you're emotionally invested in the narrative like that. But I personally, when I was researching the book, when I was investigating the cases, talking to the people, I don't mean this lightly. I'm not trying to disparaging any of this, but I kind of got immune to it, because by that time I'd investigated hundreds and hundreds of UAP sightings and dozens of abduction or close encounter or experience cases. So I kind of developed a bit of a thick skin, maybe. And I tried, the other thing is, not only had I been exposed to a lot of that material, but I tried to keep a professional distance so that I could be the dispassionate investigator and writer rather than getting emotionally drawn into the story myself.
And last question here. In that book, The Uninvited, you were very careful around the children abduction incidents. Do you think some of those incidents would be classified legally as like child molestation instances that have allegedly occurred with children and alleged abductees?
If these cases are taking place as the people allege, absolutely. Each abduction experience is arguably, in legal terms, an assault. And if it involves a child, Absolutely. But yeah, this is a very difficult area, and because of all sorts of reasons to do with consent, I'm just, I don't want to. If others research and investigate it, that's fine. I'm aware of these cases, but I think there are so many pitfalls, because we don't know what we're dealing with here. Some of these experiences may be made up. Some may reflect psychological conditions. Some may be real, but what that reality is, I don't know. And I think I'm very wary of anything involving under 18s with this.
And you do have a website. Do you want to let people know where they can find that and where they can follow you on social media?
nickpope.net is my website, and there's an email contact there which comes to me directly. And my X, formerly known as Twitter, which is the social media platform I use most, is at Nick Pope MOD.
Very good. Well, I don't think we even got to half of the fan questions today, and I don't think I got to even half of my own questions, so we'll definitely have to have you back on again sometime. We really appreciate your time, and I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to tell the viewers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to come back again, and maybe I will give shorter answers, but that way we'll get through all your questions and everything. And I should say that my latest project, which is, again, featured on my X feed, is a film about COVID, and it's called Apocalypse COVID, and that's also on Amazon.